But thank you all so much for joining us. For best-selling author Heather Fawcett will discuss her new fantasy novel, Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales, in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Heather is the New York Times, USA Today, and Sunday Times best-selling Canadian author of books for adults, kids, and teens, including Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries, Even the Darkest Stars, Ember and the Ice Dragons, The Grace of Wild Things, and more. Her books have been translated into more than a dozen languages and somehow all include dragons in one form or another. Heather has a master's degree in English literature and a bachelor's in archaeology, and she lives on Vancouver Island. So, folks, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Heather for joining us here tonight. And Heather, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here.
So Emily, here we go, right off the bat. So Heather,
I have read
right off. I'm getting it out of the way. So Heather, I have read both Emily Wilde books. I read the first one 2 years ago. I read book number 2 yesterday and today, and I'm so looking forward to book 3. I think I'm going to read it later this week. Heather, for those who are uninitiated, can you tell us a little bit sort of in general about the Emily Wilde series?
Yes, I mean, the Emily Wilde series, it basically started out from a failed middle grade book that I had wanted to write based on an idea that I had about a little girl who is raised in a fairyland and ends up kind of, learning about these different fairy species that she's living among. But that book ended up not going anywhere. And at the same time, I was really struggling with coming up with an adult fantasy story. I'd wanted to write adult fantasy my entire career. I've, of course, started out in Kid Lit in YA and middle grade. And that's where most people knew me from before the Emily Wilde series. So I ended up, fortunately, being able to take that idea, and essentially that gave me kind of the seed of the Emily Wilde series, because I had been using this book called An Encyclopedia of Faeries by Catherine Briggs as a research text for that middle grade project. And I ended up kind of just thinking to myself, what would it be like to have written something like this? What would it be like to have actually studied fairies, to have gone out into the field gathering stories from people about the fairies that live by their little village or whatnot? So that was really where the book began, and it's been kind of a crazy adventure ever since. The book started out as a standalone, actually. It was pitched to my publisher as a standalone with series potential. And so it was really only because it gained a readership and brought more and more people to the story that I was able to write the 3 books that I have written now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, your answer to that one question essentially answered my next 2 questions. But let me ask you this. So, you also write middle grade books. So how would you including YA, young adult. So how would you say writing for a young adult audience versus writing for Emily Wilde? What is the same across the board, and what differs? So writing for a teen audience or a middle-aged audience versus an adult audience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've thought about this a bit because I've, of course, written for, 3 different age ranges, of course, middle grade, 8 to 12-ish, and then teen, 12 and up, and then now adult. And I mean, there's, I think, more commonalities than there are differences. And I think that my voice, I tend to kind of focus on whimsy and humor and sort of more cozier types of fantasy. And so I bring that to all the kinds of storytelling that I do. But I would say that in general, in adult fantasy, you have a bit more space because rightly or wrongly, I think people tend to look at teen fiction and teen readers as being very impatient with their books and wanting a faster pace. I don't know if that's really true. I'm sure that there are plenty of teen readers out there that like to luxuriate in kind of more world building and richer worlds, but that's certainly something that publishing is kind of pushing. So I tend to just take a bit more time in my adult books for more world building and for more kind of tangents, I would say. Like a lot of the footnotes in the Emily Wilde books, for example, just kind of provide more lore. They're not really there. Sometimes they are there to drive the plot forward, but they're really mostly there just to get people kind of immersed in the world and to really give that kind of strong sense of place and magic. And so that would be, I would say, probably the main difference between writing for teens versus writing for adults. There's just a sense of there being kind of more room to expand on the world building and to maybe have a bit more of an erratic story structure with more kind of side quests and tangents and things like that.
And so you referenced a cozy fantasy. So can you sort of explain what that is, and would you classify your series as cozy fantasy?
I would, yeah. I think that some people wouldn't because my books do contain some darker elements. But I would definitely say that cozy fantasy is where my books could comfortably be housed. That said, I didn't actually know the term cozy fantasy when I started writing. It was something that was kind of told to me after I'd written the first book that there was this term, this subgenre called cozy fantasy. I hadn't really known what I was doing. I knew that I was writing a book that was cozy and kind of whimsical and warm, and hopefully people would find that charming. Yeah, I was just writing fantasy that felt like it was on the lighter side of the genre. I didn't want to write something that was super dark and super grim with a lot of violence and things like that. So, yeah, I just wanted to write something that was similar to my middle grade books, actually, which were on the whimsical side and on the kind of warmer, more humorous, lighthearted side. But I think you could put it in cozy fantasy for sure.
Yeah. So you referenced sort of the inspiration for the series, and you also mentioned an encyclopedia. I'm wondering what kind of research did you do for the Emily Wilde series? And yeah, so could you tell us a little bit about some of the research you did?
Um, yeah, I mean, I mentioned an Encyclopedia of Faeries by Catherine Briggs. That was definitely a really important text for me, but I also used, I believe it's called, what is it? It's by William Butler Yeats. I believe it's called Folktales of the Irish Peasantry. So that was a really important one. I was also really inspired by non-folklore books. So, for example, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. That was a huge one. I also really enjoyed the long title, I believe it's The Ladies of Grace Ado and Other Stories. That was also by Susanna Clarke, who is this really amazing writer who uses a lot of, I don't know, she kind of weaves in a lot of different footnotes and a lot of different stories from different kind of types of fairy lore. And so I took a lot of inspiration from her actually, and I think I owe her a debt of gratitude for writing those books. But yeah, those were a couple of the texts I used. For book one, I read a lot of like Icelandic and Norse folktales and myths from various sources. And then for book two, there were some Austrian folktales that I was sort of weaving in here and there. And of course, book three, I relied more on Irish folklore. So yeah, it was a big mix.
And that segues perfectly into my next question, Heather. Do you have a favorite fairy tale, and do you think it influenced you in writing this series?
Favorite fairy tale? That's a really good question. Um, well, one of the stories that actually was partly in the inspiration for Wendell's character was actually a story called The Shoemaker and the Elves, which is in the Grimm's Brothers collection of fairy stories. And that's just a story about these elves that kind of creep around at night and kind of they make shoes, really. But there are lots of fairies of this kind of type within different folklore traditions. These sorts of household brownie type fairies who kind of creep out and fix things or clean up. But I would say The Shoemaker and the Elves was probably one of the more important stories for the series, just because of that inspiration that it gave me for Wendell's character and for the kind of fairy ancestry that he has.
All right, so let's start teasing book number three. I'm going to imagine most of the folks on the call have, and those that will listen to it afterwards, have probably read books one and two. I'm going to make that assumption. We won't spoil everything from those books, but moving forward, I'm going to kind of make that assumption. So, in the first two books, we have Emily exploring isolated Icelandic forests, the Austrian Alps, and even the elusive fairy realm of the other lands. What other frontiers will readers get to experience in this new book?
Ooh, that's a good, in the third book, you mean?
Yes,
Well, without giving too much away from the third book,
yes.
I can say that the story will kind of go in a bit of a different direction. I think that the first two books have really been kind of like what I would call crossover fantasy stories or portal fantasy stories, where we see Emily kind of going in and out of these different fairy landscapes. Book three takes place almost entirely in a fairy realm. And so we really will kind of dig deep into the different layers that make up fairy, both in terms of like the common fae, who are the sort of smaller fairies and how they live, but also in terms of the kind of the nobles of the fairy realms, the courtly fae. And so we'll get those kind of almost socioeconomic layers, and we'll kind of learn more about the in-depth workings of fairy in book three.
So where you left off in book two, is that a fairly accurate depiction of the direction we're going in for book three?
Yeah, it is. I
Yeah.
think that if you've read the ending of book two, you won't be super surprised by book three.
Right, right. So you talked about your inspiration for Wendell with that grim fairy tale. What was your inspiration for Emily?
Emily was inspired more by, I would say, an archetype than by a specific person or a specific character. I sort of see Emily as fitting into this kind of socially awkward genius archetype that we see in a lot of different forms of media. I think some of the most famous examples, I'm a Star Trek fan, so I always think in Star Trek terms. I think of characters like Spock or Data. I also think of, for example, the BBC production of Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch. You can see that kind of archetype at play there as well. But you don't see a lot of women, or at least when I wrote the Emily Wilde series, I wasn't really seeing a lot of female characters in fantasy that kind of fit that particular mold. And I think it's a really fascinating dynamic, sort of like within the psychology of a character, to have someone that is so talented and so skilled at the kind of career aspect of their life, but then kind of inept and bumbling when it comes to the social aspect. It's just a really fun dynamic to play with. And it allows for a lot of growth as well, which is, for me, my favorite part of writing a story is to come up with a character who will go through this kind of internal journey and growth throughout the course of the book. So yeah, that's kind of where Emily came in. She's also just sort of inspired by some of the academics that I've known, who a lot of them, I would say, fit that type a little bit. If you're going to be so deeply immersed in one field of scholarly study, you can sometimes not be, you can kind of do that to the detriment of the other aspects of your life. At least that's according to some of the people that I've met and interacted with.
So Heather, is there a person you've met in real life where that Dr. Rose is based on? Is that an actual person that you've come across?
Well, I don't know if that would be a wise question for me to answer. I would say that with most of my characters, I've never based one character wholly on another person, but definitely you borrow traits from different people and kind of.
Well, so along those lines, aside from Emily and Wendell, are there any other characters from the past two books that will make an appearance in book number three that you're comfortable telling us about?
Well, I can say that some people may be pleased to hear that we haven't seen the last of Poe. He does pop up in book three.
So, do you have a favorite character to write and within the Emily Wilde series? And do you have a character with which you identify the most within the Emily Wilde series?
I would say my favorite character is probably Emily. Usually
Yeah.
my favorite character to write about is the protagonist. I mean, otherwise I would tell the story about a different character. But I mean, I would say that I actually did really enjoy writing Poe because he is someone who kind of came out of nowhere, which is always fun when that happens. I didn't have him in my outline at all. I just started writing the scene where he appears and he happened to be there. And so he was really kind of fun to sort of learn about and to play with. In terms of the character that I connect with the most, I mean, I might say Emily to a certain extent. I think that all of the characters that I've written, they always have some amount of overlap with me personally, although I don't write self-insert characters because I just think that's boring, to be honest. I'd rather like get to play around in the psychology of someone who's different from me. So yeah, I would say that there's some overlap there, but that's about it.
So, Um, Hypothetically, if you could go back and change or add something to the first two books of your series, what would it be and why?
I could change or add something. I don't know that I, hmm, I don't know that I would, to be honest. I think that, I mean, I could just say I would put more footnotes in because honestly, that's probably the most true answer
Yeah.
because I loved writing those footnotes. It was
Did
so
your
much fun.
publisher limit the amount of footnotes you could put in?
They didn't actually. They were very kind about that, but I knew that I couldn't have too many because otherwise it does become unwieldy. And especially like nowadays, authors, we really have to take into account the audiobook and
Yes.
how what we're writing is going to translate into audio form because that becomes such an important medium for people to just kind of get into storytelling and into books.
Well, you were
So
you were you were so conscious of this, you even had Wendell call it out, saying that he'd never known someone to have so many footnotes in their personal journal.
yeah, that was a little bit, yeah, that was a little bit of a breaking the fourth wall
Yeah.
slightly, a little bit there, but I felt like it was warranted for Wendell's character to comment on that. But yeah, so I did limit the number of footnotes just for, to try to be conscious of the different ways that people are going to be engaging with the story.
Well, and could you talk about your choice to write the story as if it was, journal entries from Emily? What were your thoughts behind that?
I've always really been interested in the epistolary structure of storytelling. One of my favorite examples from university that I studied was Dracula by Bram Stoker. And I think that I just really was fascinated by the way that that structure can kind of alter the pace and kind of be used to create momentum and drama and dramatic tension in the story. And also just to provide an even closer window into a character's psychology, because of course, when you're writing as if you're writing in the journal from the perspective of this character, there's no closer perspective, right? Everything that they're observing is a choice. Everything that they're observing is something that they would be choosing to pay attention to versus something else. So I just think it's a really fascinating way to kind of gain additional insight into the characters and also to kind of like shape the story and in some ways kind of comment on the story. The characters are sort of narrating it themselves, and that can be really fun. And it was a challenge for me. I actually really struggled with the epistolary format. It was harder than I thought it was going to be, but I think ultimately the end result was it was the right choice for this story.
And I liked how towards the end of book two you flipped the script a bit and had Wendell write a chapter. That was a very nice change of pace, and I really enjoyed the way that went. Um, so, which authors or works have significantly impacted your writing style?
Well, I mentioned Susanna Clark before. I would say that she's definitely one. I would also say probably Diana Wynne Jones is another really big one. I grew up reading her stories and they remain among my favorite books of all time. I really love her kind of combination of whimsy and humor and just the structure of her novels. I find that the plot kind of takes unexpected twists and turns and detours,
Mhm.
which I think is just really kind of cool and fun. I like when a story structure feels really organic like that.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know. I mean, I grew up reading a lot of kind of classic fantasy by authors like Anne McCaffrey and Tolkien and various others. So I would say that kind of that epic fantasy storytelling style is one that I, to a certain extent, bring to the Emily Wilde series.
So you just said you prefer when the storytelling is organic. So I think I know the answer to this question, but this is a question we ask all authors. Are you a pantser or are you a plotter?
Ah, yes. I would call myself a plantser actually,
Yeah.
because I actually started off my career as a plotter. I would have incredibly detailed outlines, ridiculously detailed. Like I would have the scene and then I would have word count targets and like sub word count targets and just everything was mapped out. And I found as I went along that for me personally, obviously, there's no one way to write a novel. The only right way is the way that works for you and gets the book out of your head and onto the page. But for me personally, I just found that that was almost kind of restrictive to me. I find I come up with a lot of ideas when I'm in that kind of creative flow state. It's almost like that opens up more spaces for ideas to arise. So I ended up adopting more of a loose structure. I still have an outline when I start. I still like to know where I'm going, but I sort of see it more as kind of like a rough map as opposed to almost kind of like a paint by numbers type thing, which I was doing before, where I just fill in, content where it needed to go. And I found that for me personally, having a looser outline, maybe only a page or two in length, which I call plantsing,
Sure.
halfway in between plotter and pantser, that's where I've been more comfortable. And that's how I wrote the Emily Wilde series.
Your world building is amazing, I have to say. And a cloak isn't just a cloak, and a pencil isn't just a pencil, and a door is not just a door, and so many twists and turns, and I don't know what's what. And so can you talk about, as a fantasy author, as a successful acclaimed fantasy author, how do you go about world building?
For me, world building is one of the most important pieces that I need to get right before I start out. I did just talk about how I'm not a plotter anymore, but with world building, I like to know what the world looks like. I like to know what the rules are. And I think that's important in terms of how the character is situated and what their kind of what the restrictions are that are kind of placed on them and their goals. So the Emily Wilde world, obviously the main difference is, of course, that fairies exist. They've been kind of scientifically proven and documented. But Emily's world is also a lot more advanced than, of course, the 1900s and 1910s were. Obviously, I mean, I think that at Cambridge, the first female scholar wasn't until like the 1940s or something, whereas it's completely normalized for women to be scholars in Emily's world. So that was a really important kind of piece to figure out beforehand, because, of course, that has a huge impact on the story and on the characters. So I need to kind of figure out those sorts of more social issues, that side of things, in addition to, having like my world maps and having like my lists of, okay, what kinds of fairies are going to be in this book? What are their backgrounds? What do they look like, etc. So yeah, I do spend a fair bit of time on the world building piece before I start. And that's just because I don't want to interrupt myself when I'm in the flow of things and writing the story. I want to have all those pieces in place before I dive in.
So, for any aspiring writers who are watching live or who may watch the recording, do you have any advice that you'd want to give to them?
My main piece of advice that I give to people who want to not just write a story, but have a career as a story in storytelling is, I think that nowadays it's really important, maybe more so than ever, to really hone your versatility. And by that, I just mean make sure that you're interested in more than one type of storytelling if you can. Very few authors these days kind of start off writing one type of story and then stay there for the entirety of their career. It's just a lot better to have many different types of stories that you're comfortable telling. So for me, I write for kids and I write for adults and I write for teens. I've written contemporary books for kids, and I also primarily write fantasy, but I have written other things as well. And that kind of has allowed me to have different places that I can go in my career, which has proven to be healthy for my career as a whole. And I've been able to kind of try out different things, which has also been a lot of fun. So yeah, basically my advice, and this is going to be like hopefully fun advice for most people, is to just read lots of different types of stories and figure out what you love and what direction your imagination might be able to take you in the future. Don't get too boxed into just writing one type of story.
Heather, you did talk earlier about some of the books that you've read, some of the authors you've read that have inspired you. Any modern authors, any current authors you're reading, whether it's fantasy or some other genre? You want to throw out any recent book recommendations you may have?
One of my favorite authors right now is actually writing sci-fi, but it's cozy sci-fi. And maybe there's some crossover here with the people listening who are like enjoying cozy fantasy, but that's Becky Chambers. She's written a bunch of different books. I really love, she has, again, really long titles for her books. I think To Be Taught If Fortunate That's my favorite by her. That's a novella. But she also has a series that starts with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, I think. So I really recommend her stuff. It's very kind of like found family, lots of cozy vibes. But as with all great sci-fi, she does raise a lot of really interesting philosophical questions over the course of the stories. So I do recommend her. Another sci-fi author that I really love is Adrian Tchaikovsky. Um, and I should probably give some fantasy recommendations as well, in case there are like people who are not fans of sci-fi out there. I recently read a book. I believe this is a debut author. It's called The Doll Makers. It's a YA fantasy. I believe Lynn Buchanan is the author's name, but it came out recently, so you should be able to find it if you look up that title. And a forthcoming book that I'm really excited about is one called The Second Death of Locke. The author's name is escaping me right now, but that's a pretty distinctive title, and it was really amazing. Epic fantasy, I would say, if you're into that. And I also really love T. Kingfisher. Pretty much everything that she writes is really, really good. I'm reading one right now, or actually I'm listening to the audiobook, and it's called Thorn Hedge. So I do recommend that one. She also writes horror. So if you like horror, she's another author that writes a lot of different types of stories. And I really love that about her. And I think she's really talented and really special.
Now, Heather, in book two, there's a dog and there's a cat, and they both kind of come to the rescue and play important roles. And so this might be the hardest question you get all night. But are you a dog person or are you a cat person?
Oh no. Well, my cat's sitting just over there, so I'd better not say that I'm a dog person, otherwise I'll be in trouble. But I have only ever owned cats. So I guess my loyalties lie there a little bit. However, I do love dogs, and I like writing both characters from both species.
So, big picture, what is the message you hope readers take away from the Emily Wilde's trilogy? I'm calling it a trilogy. Perhaps there'll be more than three books, but what do you hope in general or specifically readers take away from your Emily Wilde's writing?
So I don't normally have a specific message that I want to kind of impart into readers. When I write a book, I just really hope that readers honestly have a good time when they're reading with these characters. That is my main goal with every story that I write. For me, theme is kind of important, but for me, I mostly use it as kind of like a compass that kind of guides me as I'm working my way through a story. And the theme of the Emily Wilde books is really just, it sounds really basic, but it's the importance of relationships and the importance of kind of balancing whatever it is that's your passion in life with ensuring that you have people in your life that you can rely on and that can count on you and you can count on them. And that's really the journey that Emily is on over the course of these books. Book one, I really see as being about Emily learning to make friends because she hasn't really had any before. She's had Wendell, but I mean, Wendell's a fairy. And I mean, obviously, someone like Emily, if there's a fairy around, she's going to make friends with that fairy and none of the other humans in her orbit. And then, of course, book two is really about kind of Emily learning to connect with her family, which is represented by Ariadne. And also to form a kind of mentor-mentee relationship, which is really important. And that's something that she forms with Ferris Rose over the course of book two. Book three is really about Emily's relationship with herself and coming to terms with kind of her struggles that she's had over the course of her life and that she's felt have made life more difficult for her in various ways, but that have also been her strength. And so that's really the relationship that book three deals with. And yeah, that's the focus of the series as a whole. But readers can take from it what they will. I'm not going to give some kind of prescription for how they should interpret the books, but that's how I view them.
So for those watching live, if you have a question for Emily, feel free to get it into the chat or into the Q&A. I see three already. I'd love to see more. So we'll get to those in about 10 minutes. So Heather, I may have said Emily. I'm sorry. Heather, I meant Heather, not Emily.
You're not the first person that's done that, actually.
I'm a mess. I'm sorry, Heather. So, Heather, you've created a universe here, right? So you have the three books. I'm ignorant to how this whole thing works, but I could certainly see this being optioned into a TV series or a mini series or a movie franchise. And if that were to be the case, do you have an, and I don't know to what extent you really have the say, but who would you like to see play Emily, the character Emily?
Hmm. That's a tricky one. In all honesty, I don't watch that many movies, and so
Sure.
I'm not super familiar with celebrities that
It's okay.
uh contemporary celebrities. The only one that kind of comes to my mind off the top of my head is I think it's Audrey Plaza.
Sure.
I think she would be really good. I'm not sure. I think she's American, so I don't know how she'd do with a British accent, but I feel like she might suit sarcastic, kind of curmudgeonly Emily quite well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great choice. Let me see here. And so, by the way, so I referenced it as a trilogy, but is there? Maybe you can't even tell us, but will there be a book for Heather?
Yeah, unfortunately, I know a lot of people ask me that. Unfortunately, I'm not able to say at this point. Yeah, so I have to say
Okay,
no comment to that one, I'm afraid.
that's okay. They do seem to come out. I think they've come out every winter or so, right? So
Yeah.
we'll keep an eye out for that. Okay. And the other thing we had talked about prior to going live was the fact that you have Emily, you know, essentially researching and writing books, as part of each story. Could we ever see Emily, publish that encyclopedia or publish that book of maps? Could you see yourself publishing, I'm not sure what I would even call them, but spin-off books? You know what I'm trying to get at, Heather?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely am open to that possibility. I really, as you know, we talked about it a bit beforehand. I mentioned that someone had recently suggested that I write a cookbook for the Emily Wilde series, which I thought was a really cool idea. But I don't know, we'll see. I like the idea too of even doing like maybe a short story collection one day. There's a lot of different stories in the Emily Wilde world. That's basically the foundation of the world. So maybe. I don't really have, right now, I don't really have the time. I've got two projects on the go right now and another one that I've got to tackle before the end of the year. But I could definitely see myself going down that route one day because it does seem to be something that there is an appetite for. I do get questions from people quite often about whether there's going to be kind of like spin-offs or short story collections or something else, maybe even an encyclopedia. Maybe Emily's encyclopedia. I don't know.
uh, this is sort of a superficial question, but is there a reason why the third book has a different looking cover than the first two? The first two books were sort of dark colors, if you will, and the third one is very bright. What were you thinking there?
Well, that is really the publisher's decision. So the publisher does basically does I get to give feedback, but it is essentially the publisher's call as to what the overall look of the covers is going to be. I really think that actually bright colors, and it's funny, we initially had bright colors on the cover of the second book, and I asked for it to be darkened. It was initially going to be a lighter shade of green, much brighter and much more vibrant. But book two is very kind of autumnal themed, and I mean, it literally takes place in autumn. So, and it's kind of got some spooky vibes there, and I just didn't think that that was a great fit. So they did tone it down and darken it. However, book three, and this is, I guess, hopefully going to feel appropriate as we move towards spring, at least in my part of the world, we're moving towards spring. It is more of a spring-like setting, if I can say that without giving too much away. And so I just thought that it was appropriate, the direction that they went in with the brighter color scheme, and hopefully readers, when they read the third book, will see that as a good fit as well.
So, Emily, as I start to wind down my questioning, I know you can't tell us if there's a book four, which is fine. Are you able to tell us anything else you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm working on a standalone fantasy which is called Agnes Aubert's Mystical Cat Shelter. And it is essentially, as the title implies, it's about a magical cat shelter. It's about a woman who is running a charity for rescuing and rehabilitating street cats in Montreal, in Canada, and set in kind of an alternative 1920s Montreal. And she ends up her shelter ends up being used as kind of a front for the magic shop of basically the worst magician in the world. Has lots of dark magic and has a very dark past. And so that one's been a lot of fun. It's a very fun change of pace, similar to Emily, in which Emily is really it's a world in which fairies have been kind of scientifically proven to exist. That's the main difference. In this world, it is magicians who exist, and that is kind of the key difference between Agnes's world and ours. So that's been a really fun one. And then I'm working on actually a young adult novel, but I'm not actually able to talk about that one yet because that one hasn't been announced yet. So those are the two projects I'm juggling right now.
Sure, that's great. Let me ask you this, Heather. How long in general does it take you to write a book? Is it a 6-month process, 9-month process, 12-month process?
Usually it's about a year.
Yeah.
So, and that includes all the different components of writing a book. So
Right.
that's the outlining, the drafting, that's the different stages of revision and editing, the whole process. Well, actually, no, the editing, and if you include that in, that takes a bit longer, but basically the bulk of the book takes about a year to write.
Yeah, sounds about right. So Heather, as I start to wind down my questions, so where can folks learn more about you and your works?
So I'm on the main platform that I'm on right now is Instagram. So you can follow me over there. But I also have a Substack newsletter, which has been growing a lot recently, which is really exciting because I find that to be a really fun place to interact with readers. And I have a smaller following there, which means that I see the comments. So I'm actually able to reply and have conversations with people. So if you want to chat with me or ask me a question, go to my Substack newsletter, I would say. It's called From the Other Lands.
Oh, I like that. All right, so we will start to get to some audience questions. So Brian wants to know, do you believe in fairies and do you believe in devas, Devas? I don't know my terminology real well. But Brian wants to know, do you believe in those two things?
So I guess the broader question is, do I believe in the supernatural? I'm not closed off to the possibility. There have definitely been times when I've visited certain places. I would actually say when I was in Ireland, when I was in university, there are definitely landscapes there that have a kind of haunted feeling. And I could believe that there's something more there that is kind of beyond my abilities to perceive. But I don't, strictly speaking, believe in them. Like I'm not going to go out hunting for fairy. I mean, obviously that would be a bad idea if they do exist. That would be a very dangerous thing to do. I would say I don't necessarily believe, but I'm not like anti-belief in fairies.
Yeah, and that leads us into the second audience question, which you've sort of answered, but an anonymous attendee asks, have you personally ever had any otherworld-like experiences? And if so, are you comfortable talking about them?
Hmm. No, I mean, I would say more kind of in this sort of vein of ghosts rather than fairies. And so maybe that's a little bit off topic for this discussion here. And I don't know if I necessarily want to share those.
That's okay.
But yeah, I'm open, like I said, I'm open to the possibility of these things existing.
Marcia asks if I can include your book recommendations in the follow-up email with the recording. Marcia, anything for you. I will do that for you, okay? And Heather, so folks, now's the time. We'll give it a few more minutes. If you have a question, get them in. Heather, I want to ask you, since we have a couple of extra minutes here before we log off here, what are your thoughts on there's this unfortunate craze in America with lots of folks trying to ban books. And Heather, as a middle grade author, as a young adult author, as an author of adult fantasy books, what are your thoughts on book banning?
Well, I think my thoughts are probably going to be in line with 99% of the authors that you interview here, which is that, of course, book bans are terrible. It's very sad whenever I hear, and I know authors who have been personally impacted by this, and it's really devastating for them. And I think that my main goal, whenever I hear that a book is being banned, I go out and buy it. And I highly recommend, if you have the means, anyone out there, that's the best way to support these authors who are going through what is a really difficult struggle. And I wish them all the best of it. I mean, I'm in Canada, so I'm a little bit more insulated from it, but not Not entirely, that's for sure.
Liliana asks, did you always want to be an author? Is the experience all that you hoped it would be?
I didn't actually, I did always want to write. I've always loved storytelling, and I wrote my first story when I was like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. But I think that I always kind of saw authors as these sorts of almost kind of godlike beings out there just on a sort of higher plane of existence. I never really, when I was younger, I never really thought that I could have a job telling stories and that I could make money off of it. But it was absolutely something that I loved to do. It wasn't until I was a little bit older that I actually started pursuing querying and looking into getting an agent and getting a publishing deal more seriously. In terms of whether or not it is everything that I envisioned, I think that in a certain light it is. But obviously, I think that getting published is kind of the first step. And I think that when you're the outside looking in, it can kind of seem like if you get a book published, you've kind of got it made, and that's, your career. But most people's careers have a lot of ups and downs, and that's something that I've been surprised by. But I've been in this business for 10 years now, and I've been doing this full time for like several years, about half that time, which has been amazing. And I feel really fortunate and really grateful. Overall, it's been an amazing experience, especially with opportunities like this where I get to interact with readers. That's probably my favorite part.
And now the questions are coming in. See that, I threatened ending it early, and now we get the questions. That's how it works. So Kim, let's see here. So Kate says, do you feel like your English literature degree has helped you with your writing, and your archaeology degree helped you with your world building?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. English literature is kind of a funny degree. People always tell you that it's a useless thing to study and you should be doing something more serious with your time and money. But it's worked out well for me. I was exposed to a lot of different books over the course of my degree that I never would have read otherwise. And I, of course, was immersed in them and studying them on a more in-depth level. I remember one time I wrote, I think it was like a 12-page essay on a 10-line poem, which was really kind of studying the nitty-gritty of language and how to fit words together and make them hopefully sound beautiful. And so definitely my English degree was useful. My archaeology degree, yes, absolutely. Archaeology is essentially the study of other worlds. It's a study of other cultures, many of which no longer exist. I kind of specialized in a few different areas, but I did a field school in Italy. So I was studying a lot of like Roman archaeology and yeah, learning about these kind of vanished ancient worlds and how people lived and getting to kind of handle their stuff. I think just kind of that tactile nature of archaeology, it's really inspiring. And I do think that creatively, having that experience has really helped me as a fantasy author, even though it might not seem obviously connected. I think that there is a connection there for me.
By the way, the person who asked that, Heather, was Kate, one of my colleagues who I mentioned to you before this talk. So she's a big,
Oh,
big fan of yours. Okay.
oh, awesome. Thank you.
Uh,
Hi.
so, and another anonymous, so an anonymous attendee asks, what has been your favorite creation in regards to your world building, and are there any new ones to look forward to in book number 3?
Hmm. My favorite creation. I'm wondering if that means in terms of like fairy species or,
Let's
hmm.
assume it does.
Yeah. I liked coming up with Poe's bakery and just
Yeah.
his tree home and just the way that he kind of sometimes it has windows and sometimes it doesn't and he's baking bread in there and there's like smoke coming out of a little chimney. I really enjoyed coming up with that aspect of the world and just kind of figuring out how the fairies would be kind of woven into our landscape and kind of the interfaces between their world and ours. I thought that was really fascinating. And sorry, what was the second part of the question again?
And then what are some of what is maybe one or two new creations that we can look forward to in book number 3?
Ah, okay. Well, book number 3. So I teased it a little bit in book 2. I really had a lot of fun with. There's a type of tree in Wendell's world, which are called attentive oaks, and they are definitely one of my more unique, slightly creepy creations. But I had a lot of fun with those. They're kind of somewhat sentient in a couple of different ways, and they have a decently prominent role in book 3. So look forward to those, or not, because they're a bit creepy. But
Well, I'm hoping for a royal wedding, but don't tell me, no spoilers, no spoilers. So an anonymous attendee asks, this is actually, I'm going to combine two questions. They ask, do you have any advice for someone seeking an agent? And what do you think was the key to your success breaking through into getting your works published?
So I've had that question before about agents. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to give advice because my advice would be really outdated. I got my agent back in 2015 and the process was just completely different back then. I've had the same agent since, which is, I've been fortunate in that regard. So I don't know. I would ask someone else for advice on that front. But definitely, I think that one thing that probably hasn't changed in terms of finding agents is ensuring that your book is high concept, if it can be. I know that's kind of an annoying term for some readers to hear because not everyone writes high concept books, but if you can frame your story in such a way that it sounds high concept and sounds kind of pitchable to publishers, then that's going to help you out a lot. So make sure you think about that. And what was the other half of the question? Sorry.
What was your key to success breaking through into getting your works published?
Well, so this industry is obviously talent is important and hard work is important, but a really important component is luck and having the right story at the right time. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that I've been lucky at different stages in my career. I started off writing young adult fantasy at a time when young adult fantasy was really booming and publishers were purchasing a lot of it. And I had a young adult fantasy book. It was just a little bit of an easier, obviously it's never easy to get published. There's so much competition no matter what genre you're writing in. But if you're writing in a genre where there's a decent amount of demand, then that can help. And that can kind of be your sort of on entry into publishing. From there, you can go in different directions, as I've done. I've written lots of different types of stories. But yeah, if you can start out in a genre that's really popular right now or a category that's popular, then that's just going to make that process a little bit easier for you.
Right. All right, well, I peppered you with over 15 questions. We had at least 5 questions from the audience. So I'm comfortable wrapping up. Heather, was there, so I'm a little new at this interviewing. Usually I am sort of the tech person behind the scenes. Was there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? Is there anything you want to tell the audience that we haven't covered yet?
I don't know. I think that your questions have all been great. I really appreciated all of them. I would say, book 3 is out tomorrow. And if you're so inclined to put my next book, Agnes Aubert's Mystical Cat Shelter, on your TBR on Goodreads, feel free to go ahead and do that. That would be amazing to see that support. And thank you so much. I've really had a great time here.
So, folks, let's give Heather a big virtual round of applause for a great discussion. Folks, look for an email for those watching live. Look for an email from me later tonight with the recording, as well as information about some other upcoming virtual author visits. And we'll have a link to Wesley Books to purchase a copy of Heather's latest. And then for those watching live, please take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey that should pop up when the Zoom ends. Jane says, Heather, thank you for the engaging books. So many fans on the line. Yeah, a lot of similar comments. Heather, thanks so much for being so generous with your time the night before the release. Really appreciate you spending 45 minutes with us. And we wish you best of luck with book number 3 and with all your other future books.
Thank you so much. I've really had a great time. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.